Oh, I think it's been really excellent. I've enjoyed all the talks. I've been jokingly saying, that opening keynote was a little rough, but since then it's been getting better, but that's just because I was the guy who gave the opening talk. I've really enjoyed it this year. There have been some great talks, excellent opportunity to meet and talk to people that I've gotten to know over the years and who I've worked on a lot of things with. And as always, this has turned out to be one of those events that I really look forward to each year. There have been some shifts over the years. I think when I first started coming to LCA back in 2002, there was much more emphasis on Linux itself, on the kernel and on sort of the core of the distributions and the operating system itself. I certainly came in large part the first year because of an invitation to be part of the first ever mini conference associated with LCA, which was a Debian distribution mini conference. And now, there really aren't things like distribution-oriented mini-conferences anymore. Things have sort of moved upwards and outwards. There are more discussions that maybe have a greater social significance. There are more discussions about interesting things happening in application space. It was a really excellent talk by one of my very good friends yesterday about the use of Lego and Arduino in an educational setting. And these are, a little more a little more sort of oriented towards the use of technology and a little bit less about all of the geeky internals of how we make it work. Though, of course, there's still plenty of those kinds of talks here too. I think over the years I have seen the conference sort of expand its role from being just about Linux. I mean, it's called Linux Conference Australia. Now Linux is sort of the euphemism for referring to the entire open source ecosystem and this idea of collaborative development and maintenance of software and related data and so forth. Linux actually runs lots of things in this world. As recently as 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, I was in my job at HP still sort of running around the world talking to CIOs of various companies about what was Linux, why should they care, how should they fit it into their planning and so forth. And today it's really turned around. The question is, if it's not running Linux, why isn't it? Linux is running the vast majority of sites that are on the World Wide Web. It's responsible for a substantial amount of the sites that are used for everything from airline reservations to air traffic control systems, stock market exchanges, all of those sorts of big computing things. And then in our personal lives, lots more devices. If you're running an Android phone, you're running the Linux kernel, whether you realize that or not. My new digital television at home is running Linux on the inside. Just all over the place. Everything from smart wristwatches and other tiny mobile devices to the world's largest supercomputers. I think the last time the top 500 supercomputing list came out, that it was 90-some% of those systems that are running Linux. So the operating system has had a very sort of pervasive influence on how we think about and do computing in all kinds of ways today. Well, it certainly seems to me that when we started the whole free software open source movement, the objective we had, this is something I talked about in my keynote earlier in the week, the objective that we really had was to try and empower people. And part of this has to do with the fact that in the open source world, the licenses we've chosen to put our software under are licenses which ensure that every user has the potential of becoming a developer and being able to take great deal of control of their own system, their own destiny, making things better, sharing the changes and improvements they make with their friends and so forth. And it's certainly true that a lot of the mobile devices, phones and things, tablets and so forth that we're using today are sold primarily on the basis of the shiny applications and the fact that they can be good communications and media player devices. But most of them, particularly the ones that are based on an operating system that includes Linux and other open source technologies, are things that people can write applications for. They can do work on them. They can try to get into the innards of them. My big concern really is that, from an educational perspective and so forth, we seem less focused on this notion of people sort of being empowered to take control of their own devices and their own data and their own destiny than I would really like. But I don't really think that's the fault of the device inventors and manufacturers as much as sort of a general societal malaise about the extent to which we should take personal responsibility, interest, and want to be working ourselves on improving our own situation and that of everyone around us. Like most things in the modern world, the answer is complicated. And the reason it's complicated is that I see immense benefits for individuals and for society as a whole around the existence of what we now sort of call social media. This notion that instead of always being a consumer, that you can actually create and publish little bits and pieces of yourself in a way that you can share with your friends and family and sort of build that expanding social network, and that we can have some people have talked about the notion that this helps to democratize society, because now instead of a small number of people with opinions being listened to by the masses, the opinions are formed by sort of the nature of the mass communication. And that's wonderful, and certainly I have watched people that I know and love dearly who have had sort of transformative experiences, building better interconnections with their friends and with the rest of the world, and having a much richer communications experience because of these things. The flip side, though, is that most of the social media sites that people think about today are run by commercial interests. And they are, as a consequence, no matter how noble their intentions are, they are constrained to operate within the legal systems and expectations of the jurisdictions in which they operate. And that means that if you put all of your life on a commercial social networking site, all of your photos, all of your stories, your videos, and so forth, you really don't have any way of being assured that those are still your data objects. Other things might happen to them. Legal processes might cause things that you thought were private to become publicly exposed and so forth. And I think as a consequence, this is one of the reasons I've been very involved in projects like the Freedom Box project, where we're trying to help create devices that will help people to take more personal ownership and control of their data, and to in effect be able to build and maintain personal privacy in an internet age. Well, it's one of my hobby obsessions, is playing around with high-power model rockets, which is more common in the US than a lot of other places, but actually here in Australia there's a very active high-power rocketry community, and I've actually had the opportunity to participate in some launches here and hope to be able to do more of that in the future. But I think when I was a kid, I was very interested in everything around me about how the world worked. And so the sciences that I was interested in were sort of the harder, more physical sciences. I loved chemistry, I loved physics, I loved mechanical engineering. My grandfather had been a machinist, and I learned lots about sort of how mechanical systems work and how to think about the world. And I also discovered at a very early age that I'm fundamentally a tool-making kind of person. I like to be able to take the things that are in the world around me and to be able to fix them and improve them, and make new versions of the tools that help me do the things that I want to do. And so that led me down a relatively sort of hard science path. I've always been interested in space. I've been interested in space exploration, the technologies around space. Playing around with rockets is sort of related to that. I've had the opportunity in the past to help design and build parts that went onto amateur radio satellites. And I had the opportunity, a decade or so ago, to participate in a launch campaign at the European Space Agency's Launch Center in French Guiana, when we put an amateur radio satellite on top of a launch vehicle and put it into orbit. And I tell people there are solder joints and lines of code of mine in orbit today, and that's not something a lot of folks can say. But again, that was all done as a volunteer. Those were hobby activities. They were not things I was being paid to do. Today, the problem is I'm interested in lots and lots of things, and so it's very hard for me to pin down a particular area. I think what I'm most interested in now is making sure that my kids and their friends and the other folks that I interact with are exposed to sort of a rich set of scientific influences, so that they too are curious about and are interested in understanding how the world works, and taking a very realistic and pragmatic view when all kinds of questions come up, where being educated about science and understanding how things work on some fundamental level can allow you to make a much more fundamentally better set of decisions for yourself and the rest of the world. I really hope that the trend that I think we're on now of more and more openness in systems, software, in the access to data, in governmental processes, in this notion that we are stronger as a world when we are all empowered to take control and to work on things, to hack on things, to feel empowered to collaborate together. If we can continue that trend, then I think the human race has a very positive future, and I will have been tickled to have had a very small part in helping to make that happen. History's been full of science fiction authors and things like that painting sort of dystopian futures, and I think we're very possibly now on a path to proving all of those folks wrong, and to suggesting that maybe the human race really can get it right. And a large part of that, I think, is this sort of notion that if we're open and if we engage in collaborative processes, that makes the world a better place than when we're all competing with each other and fighting all the time.